interrogations as very unreasonable and unnecessarily harsh. The official records provide ample evidence to us that immigration officials looked favorably upon immigrants of all racial backgrounds who demonstrated refinement, wealth, and status. While his countrymen were being turned away in droves, Vashna Das Bagai had no trouble being admitted into the country in 1915. And that was because Vashna was a well-educated man from an upper-class family in Peshawar, present-day Pakistan. He and his family were immediately landed after Vashna showed immigration inspectors that he had bought $25,000 in cash with him. Immigration officials also treated women differently from men. The ones who faced the most scrutiny were those who were traveling alone or who had suspicious moral past. Even married women, though, traveling with their husbands, sometimes faced difficulties entering the country. Their right to enter was based on whether or not their husbands could support them. Their own ability to support themselves was not considered relevant. So you take the case of Rose Lewis, a white Englishwoman who was married to Emil Lewis, a black ship steward from the island of Mauritius off of South Africa. In 1918, she was excluded as a person likely to become a public charge. This is after her husband had been excluded for being illiterate. He was slated for deportation, and it was expected that he probably won't be around to support her. Now, her argument that she had worked as a stewardess to help support the family, and that they were just passing through the United States to get to Canada, did not change the minds of the immigration inspectors. This couple and their 7-week-old son were detained on Angel Island for 6 months and then deported back to Hong Kong.
All of the immigrants resented being confined like criminals behind barbed wire fences and locked doors, and of being separated from their families while in detention. But again, there were marked differences in their detention experiences. These Russian students, who were stuck on Angel Island for 3 months in 1923 because of the 1920s quota laws, wrote home about their spacious quarters, the good food, visits from friends, and the musical concerts and plays that they were allowed to put on at the station. Now, if you know anything about Angel Island's history, the descriptions that these Russian students had very different from Chinese immigrant descriptions. So, for example, in contrast, Chinese detainees complained about the overcrowded conditions in their barracks, the poor quality of food, and the lack of freedom. They were confined to their quarters at all times except for meals and 2 exercise periods in the adjacent courtyard. Only the women were allowed to go out for walks under guard, and they were not allowed visitors until their cases had been settled. It was like being in prison, said Mak Jin Sing. Everyone suffered great pain and anguish, worrying about whether or not we will be allowed to enter the U.S. The living space was so small and confining, it just made us feel more depressed and angry. Immigrants also reacted to their detentions on Angel Island in different ways. The Chinese wrote poetry to express their anger, and they hired lawyers like Oliver Stidger to appeal their cases. Oliver Stidger was one of the most active lawyers in San Francisco for Chinese immigration during this time. Japanese immigrants, on the other hand, were able to rely on their home country as a counterweight to any discrimination. Because Japan was able to negotiate a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement with the U.S., Japanese immigrants had the shortest stay and the lowest rate of deportation among all immigrant groups. Korean, Russian, and Jewish refugees had an extensive network of ethnic and religious organizations to assist them. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, for one, had a great track record for winning legal appeals. And we know that immigration interpreter David Lee used his influence as president of the Korean National Association to help hundreds of Korean immigrants get landed. There were also those without support, either from their homeland or from an organized ethnic community, and that's the case of the Sikhs from Punjab. They suffered high deportation rates. From 1908 to 1920, 66% of all South Asian applicants were rejected, usually on the grounds that they had hookworm or that they were likely to become public charges. That was the official language for being poor and likely to go on welfare. Unlike the Japanese government, the British government, which ruled over India, could not be counted on to support Indians abroad. And the South Asian community at the time was too small and too poor to offer any real assistance.
So in conclusion, while the number of immigrants passing through Angel Island pales in comparison to the large numbers of immigrants passing through Ellis Island, it is Angel Island and its greater racial diversity that allows us to best understand how U.S. immigration policies and their discriminatory treatment of immigrants played out in daily practices at the nation's borders, and what that meant for the immigrants themselves. Angel Island complicates the celebratory history of American immigration that focuses only on European immigrants coming through Ellis Island and achieving the American dream. The poems carved into the barrack walls of Angel Island and former detainees' stories of unjust treatment at the immigration station force us to also confront America's history of immigration restriction and discriminatory immigration laws.
Island was important in its own time, and it remains vitally important today when debates over immigration and race continue to divide the country. Just this past week, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Arizona's controversial immigration law. It rejected most parts, but it upheld one of the most controversial parts, the so-called Show Me Your Papers clause, which allows local police to check the immigration status of people they stop if they think that that person may be in the country without proper documentation. This harkens back to the early period of Chinese exclusion. Immigrant advocates fear that this law will enable racial profiling. It is clear that immigration will continue to be a major political topic in this year's elections, in local communities, in the White House, in the halls of Congress, and in our courts, as Congress and America tries to address the immigration situation again. Angel Island represents the best and the worst of American history. It is the story of both America's welcome to immigrants and its history of immigration restriction. Remembering both sides of this complex history helps us recognize what is still great about the United States and what remains to be done for America to uphold its promise as a nation of immigrants. Thank you very much.
Now we are going to move into the storytelling portion of our program for today. And the list of speakers on your program stand, but we are going to move Nick Friesen's film up above them and start with Jeff Chin, who's the filmmaker who made this film about Nick Friesen. Nick Friesen died just last year. Otherwise, he would be here to tell his own story. And we are just so grateful that Jeff was able to film his story for posterity. Jeff?
Thank you very much. It's a really great honor to be here today. Again, my name is Jeffrey G. Chin. I had the opportunity to meet Nick Friesen, who is a Russian Mennonite who immigrated to the United States in 1929. He has a fantastic story, and he was a very active individual. And meeting him about 3 years ago, just to get started with the interview, he was like still chopping down trees in his backyard. So he's a very strong and active individual. He has a very fantastic and inspirational story. We also have many similar narratives on the website for Angel Island, so at aiisf.org, where you can look at other immigrant profiles. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this, and this will be a great opportunity to get a little bit of a perspective of an individual who lived for 97 years in his immigrant journey to America. Can we dim the lights, please?
we're coming at Angel Island for this presentation from a little bit different point of view, as you'll see later on. I also had music, but it crashed on me, so Jeff, I'm going to hire you for a consultant next time we have to do this. Okay, let's go back here. Can you just go back? Or can we go back one? Yeah, just go back one. There we go. The Angel Island Immigration Station stands today as a peaceful and solemn monument to the thousands of immigrants that passed through its gates, to those who were denied, and to those who gave up hope and died before they could make it through. These people have come to America with the hope of a better life, that they all have an amazing story of survival and perseverance. Okay. My grandparents, Tye Leung and Charles Schultz, are both very much a part of this story, but from the other side of Angel Island's gates. Both of them were from immigrant families and worked their way up from poor beginnings to honorable service with the Federal Immigration Services on the island. Along the way, they fell in love and had to pay a serious price for their choice. Tye Leung was born in San Francisco in August of 1887. Her father was making $20 a month in a shoe shop, and her mother was working in a woman's boarding house while raising Tye's 2 brothers and 5 sisters in a 2-room apartment on Ross Alley. Tye went to the Presbyterian Mission on Stockton Street, and this eventually led her to Miss Donaldina Cameron, who then led Tye to her historic destiny. Charles Schultz was born to a Scottish mother and a German father, both of whom came to California from Illinois in the early 1880s. Charles' father was a postmaster in the silver mining town of Ruby Hill, Nevada, and he's still buried there. He was buried there. He died when Charles was very young. Charles was raised by his mother in Santa Cruz, and he came to San Francisco when he was 19. Okay. The Angel Island Immigration Station was opened in January of 1910 to replace the deplorable and inhumane conditions in the previous immigration shed on Pier 40, and also some wanted to believe this would further isolate Chinese immigrants from American shores. This is where Tye and Charles would meet and fall in love. Tye, at the age of 23, was to be sent off to Idaho by her family for an arranged marriage, and she didn't want to go. She ran off to seek shelter at the Presbyterian Mission at Sacramento and Stone Alley, 1920 Sacramento, known today as Cameron House. It was there she learned English and became a valuable assistant to the famed missionary and crusader, Miss Donaldina Cameron, for translating as they worked to rescue Chinese girls from the many brothels in the area at the time. When the new immigration station opened, Miss Cameron was asked to recommend one of her young women as an interpreter. She selected Tye, who was appointed as a Chinese interpreter and assistant matron for the women at the station. At 23 years of age, Tye Leung became the very first Chinese-American woman to be a federal civil servant for a total of $720 a year, comparing that to her father making only $20 a month at the shoe shop. The Presbyterian magazine, The Far West, had printed this story of Tye, our bright little interpreter, with gushing admiration and congratulations for this dear Christian girl to do the work among heathen women. It was noted that many eyes were wet after Tye thanked the ladies of the Occidental Board for their care and education, for giving her this opportunity, as she had asked God's blessings on their efforts. In March, the New York Daily Tribune ran an article about Tye's historic federal appointment. It was noted that only 9 years before, she was rescued from very dangerous conditions, and now she will be the assistant to the matron in charge of women at the immigration station. In August of 1911, Tye got an appointment to full interpreter with a raise to a yearly salary of $840. So she was working her way up in the world. Of course, this made all the news also. In May of 1912, San Francisco newspapers all reported that Tye Leung became the first Chinese woman to vote in an American presidential election. The Chronicle even wrote, "Even a Chinese woman, unperturbed as if carved from ivory, got up into the front rank of progress and cast a vote as naturally as a hen lays an egg and with less noise about it." Amazing. The San Francisco Daily News thought they had a scoop about Tye's early life, that Tye was born a slave, as absolute as any black child in the 1850s. They even had to include the crude illustrations on either side of her picture, a woman being whipped on one side and casting a vote on the other. Of course, that was never true, as witnessed on the bottom by the small retraction they had to print the next day. This telegram for a while was a mystery to our family until I realized, after reading all the newspaper articles printed in sequence, that the editor obviously was very embarrassed that they had the story wrong, that she was a slave woman. So this telegram, to kill the story in newspapers all across the country, was more out of a sense of we messed up and got the wrong story, as opposed to any other racial prejudice. The San Francisco Call saw fit to photograph Tye behind the wheel of a Studebaker Flanders in Stone Alley next to the Presbyterian Mission. You could tell the brickwork, to take a look in the picture there, of Cameron House. Somehow they wanted to combine the story of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's love of automobiles to Tye's historic voting in an American presidential election. To my knowledge, my grandmother never had a driver's license, nor did she ever drive a car. She was only 4'11", and she never met Dr. Sun. But it certainly is an iconic photograph. Okay. Charles' path to Angel Island was no less dramatic. Growing up in Santa Cruz with only his mother, Charles worked, as many young men did in those days, in many jobs. He was the head usher at the Palms Theater, a printing press operator, delivery boy. He ended up being a gunner's mate in the Naval Militia, and finally a conductor on the Santa Cruz Electric Railway before coming up to San Francisco. Here's a photograph of young Charles from his Naval Militia stint, or as we call it today, the Naval Reserve. He's posing with his shipmates from the USS Badger, manning a naval artillery piece in Santa Cruz. Charles arrived in San Francisco in 1901 and promptly got a job as a conductor and later motorman on the Sutro and Market Street Railway, the railway that went out to Sutro Baths. Looking perhaps, though, for more excitement, Charles became a private patrolman with the famed Harry Morse Detective Agency in 1903, covering Meigs Wharf, which is now Fisherman's Wharf, in Chinatown. In September 1903, night patrolman Schultz was in a chase and a shootout with a dangerous Chinese desperado and suspected Tong assassin named Yi Fu on the corner of Washington and DuPont, now known as Grant Avenue. Yi had been wanted for the police for the past 6 months on a murder charge and was identified by a passerby who then flagged down my grandfather, and they engaged in a shootout and chase, making the newspapers. Okay. Eventually, Charles' adventures in law enforcement would lead him to a job as an inspector with the U.S. Immigration Service. As fate would have it, he was posted to the newly opened immigration station at Angel Island. We don't know exactly how or when or where Charles met Tye at Angel Island, but the happy result was that they fell in love and wanted to get married. However, mixed-race marriages, especially those of the white and Chinese race, had been illegal under California since 1850, with the law being strengthened in 1880 and 1905 and was not repealed until 1948. Tye and Charles had to go up to Washington State, Vancouver, Washington, to get married. Back in San Francisco, they settled down the best they could under the circumstances. They must have been very brave and very much in love to be willing to endure the storms of prejudice and discrimination that followed them. Finally, in early 1913, this mixed marriage relationship was too much for the Immigration Service to handle. Tye was asked to resign her position as interpreter, and Charles also had to give up his job as an immigration inspector. And this is the official resignation letter. Still, they stayed together, never moving very far from Tye's humble beginnings on Ross Alley. They settled down on Joyce Alley and tried to find new jobs. Charles took jobs as an editor, insurance salesman, and then back to his previous profession as a motorman on the streetcars of the United Railway of San Francisco. In 1915, Tye took a job at the Chinese Tea Garden at the Pan-Pacific Exposition World's Fair, built down there on what we now know as the Marina Greens. Charles finally settled down for his very last job as a conductor on the Southern Pacific Railway in the famed Pullman cars. Okay. Tye and Charles had two sons, Frederick, my father, and Theodore, my uncle. My father is on the left and my uncle is on the right. Theodore looked more mixed race than my father, forever earning him the nickname of Uncle Ducky, Duckwalk being the Chinese word for German. Theodore served in the U.S. Army. He fought in combat in Italy in World War II and again saw combat in Korea, retiring from the Army in 1962. And my father worked in the Kaiser shipyards during the war, married and raised a successful family. They later on had two daughters. Donaldina was named for Miss Donaldina Cameron, the beloved Presbyterian missionary. My Auntie Louise later gained a small amount of fame as a local movie extra, appearing in such films as Blood Alley, filmed in China Camp, starring John Wayne, Bullet, in which she was laying in a hospital bed as star Steve McQueen walked by in San Francisco General, and if you remember Star Trek IV, as Spock and Kirk walking down a North Beach alley, a Chinese woman comes yelling at Everett, one of the other extras. She's yelling at him in Chinese as Spock and Kirk walk by. Well, that's my aunt. Charles passed away in 1935 from cancer at the age of 54. He was an accomplished musician, playing French horn in many bands and orchestras. He enjoyed photography, as evidenced as with many of the photographs you see here today. Most of these are all family photographs. He had a full life caring for his own mother until her death in 1929, as well as his own family. Charles endured much for the love of my grandmother, sadly not living long enough to see Mrs. Sedgwick. As Charles grew ill and eventually passed away, Tye worked hard to support the family. She went to school at night to learn bookkeeping, worked at Chinese hospital as a social worker, and eventually as a telephone operator at the famous Chinatown Telephone Exchange on Washington below Grant from 1926 until her retirement in 1946. After that, she occasionally worked as an interpreter in the courts to favor those in need, such as war brides. In her later years, Tye remained active as a member of the Pacific Bell Pioneers, and especially her retired co-workers from the old Chinatown Exchange. She was also involved in many of the senior programs at the old Chinese Rec Center on Mason Street. She was an honored guest at many wedding banquets. She still walked the streets and hills of Chinatown with a steady energy, spending time with friends, the occasional mahjong game, and trips to Reno on the bus. Tye Leung Schulze passed away in 1972 at the age of 84. She lived her last 7 years in Pingyuan, never straying far from her deep roots in Chinatown. I'm so glad I was able to visit her in Chinese hospital just before she passed away, and that I got to tell her how much I loved her. At that time, she was still my loving grandmother. It never dawned on me at the time just how big her mark was on American history. In the 1980s, women pioneers were starting to get the historical recognition they deserved. So in April of 1980, 8 years after Tye passed away, San Francisco Chronicle reporter Ken Whang wrote an article about her as a liberated Chinese woman who was ahead of her time. My father was quoted as in his typical understated way as saying, "Yeah, I guess you could say my mother was an unusual woman." So we see today Angel Island Immigration Station as a peaceful and solemn monument to the hopes and dreams of thousands of immigrants from all over the world. It has been called the Ellis Island of the West, and now it stands with a purpose to educate and inform future generations of the struggles of their forebears. But to me, the Angel Island Immigration Station is a living part of my family history. I am proud and humbled and deeply touched to actually be able to walk the same stairways and the hallways that Tye and Charles walked so many years ago. That is where they worked, they met, and they fell in love. To history, it's all about Tye being a pioneering American woman. But to myself and my family, it's just about a wonderful love story that still endures to this day. Thank you.
You, Ted, for that heartwarming story. Our next speaker is Janice Muto, and she'll be telling us the story of Hisayo Yoshino Makamoto, her mother.
Thank you, Erika and Judy, for allowing me to tell the story of my mother, Hisayo Yoshino, who as a young girl came to America from Japan as a picture bride and of a brief experience at Angel Island. I'm Janice Muto, the youngest of her 6 children born in America. We all grew up on a farm in Northern California, and as a child, I had often wondered how my mother and father had met and what their experiences were in Japan. Unfortunately, because of the very busy, hectic farm life, my parents never really had the time to spend time on reflecting about how they met or what their lives were like in Japan. So it was only as an adult, many years later, that I learned from my mother her story. She came one summer to spend some time with us in Concord to recuperate from cataract eye surgery. It was a hot June summer in Concord, and we did not have air conditioning in our house. So I enticed my mother to sit on the pool steps to try to keep cool. And I asked, "Mom, how did you meet Dad? And why did you come to America?" With a very sly grin, my mother, at the age of 73, said, "To avoid having a mother-in-law." Hisayo was born March 16, 1894, in a village near Hiroshima, Japan, to parents who were farmers. Now, according to Japanese custom, the eldest son, when he marries, inherits the family property and whatever wealth is involved. However, it also obligates him with his wife to care for his parents until their dying days. Now, my mother said one of her very best friends, when she turned 16, was married to an oldest son. And regularly, every other weekend, she would come home weeping to her parents, and she would bemoan and complain to all of her friends because her mother-in-law was making her young married life a living hell. So with her friends' tearful stories in mind, Hisayo, when she heard that there was a young Japanese man in America who was looking for a bride, she jumped at the chance because she said there would be no mother-in-law in America. Somehow she managed to persuade and cajole her parents to have her released from the pre-arranged marriage. Now back then, in Japan, the economic times were very difficult, she said, and it was rumored with lots of stories that America was really very prosperous. She said she thought the streets were paved in gold. That probably was stories left over from the California gold rush days. Well, after an exchange of family background and information, both parents found the marriage offer mutually acceptable, and so photos were exchanged. That is how my mother became one of thousands of picture brides who came to America from Japan. She said after about 2 years of processing and lots of paperwork and things of that sort, my mother at the age of 18, unwittingly but courageously made a choice to leave her family her homeland, to come to an unknown country, to marry an unknown man that she had only seen on the photo. She said she set sail on August the 10th, 1912, for what she termed a stomach-wrenching long voyage across the Pacific Ocean. And upon arrival, the passengers disembarked at Angel Island. For the women, she said, were housed in separate floors from the men. She said they were all interviewed and given a physical examination, and if their paper documents were all satisfactory, they generally were released within 2 to 3 days. Unfortunately for my mother, the doctors found that she had intestinal parasites. So she had to take medication on a daily basis, and she was detained for 3 weeks. She said the time passed very slowly because there was nothing to do. She said the food was terrible, and she cried a lot because by then she was really homesick and she desperately wanted to return to Japan, and she deeply regretted her decision to come to America. There was even a suggestion by an older woman that she should try to bribe the doctor to hasten her release. But my mother said she knew that was wrong, and that the fear of getting caught and sent back to Japan in disgrace was enough to even not entertain such a suggestion. Well, I guess she got tired and finally was able to pass pretty good bowel movements without the worms. She finally passed her physical exam, and she was met by Dad, Sahei Makimoto, in San Francisco. They were married at the Hiroshima Hotel in San Francisco on September the 13th, 1912. It was officiated by Reverend Hirota, along with an immigration officer and an interpreter. Mother was 18 at the time, and father was 28. This photo that you see is the official wedding photo. I wish I could tell you that my mother lived happily ever after, but sadly that was not to be the case, because after the marriage ceremony, the very next day, they left on horse and buggy for Loomis, California, where my father was a farm laborer, and he had contracted 200 acres of fruit orchard with 5 other Japanese men. My mother said she got off the buggy very tired. It was a long trip. And all of a sudden she was surrounded by 5 young Japanese men who were eagerly waiting for introductions. She said she was terrified because she didn't know what was expected of her. Her mother had warned her about the ill intentions of young men. And not only that, but she learned that she was going to be the only woman on the farm because none of the other men had yet married. My mom said she was so deeply upset and disappointed in her situation. She said she cried bitterly, day and night for a long time. Poor Dad, he didn't know what to make of this young woman that he had just married. So in desperation, he made her a deal. He said if she would gaman, or persevere, for 3 years, he would try to save up enough money to send her back to Japan. So she said slowly, she made up her mind that she had to make the best of her situation, and so she adjusted to her life, where she cooked, she cleaned, and she worked very hard helping out on the farm. Now soon, a few of the other men had sent away for picture brides, and as the women slowly arrived, my mother said it was less lonely for her. At the end of the 3 years, Mom had finally adjusted to her new life in America as a wife, and more recently as a mother to a daughter. Thankfully so, or I might not be here standing before you telling her of her story. After hearing of her early hardships in America, I could, as an adult, fully appreciate my mother for the strong and courageous woman that she was. She managed to survive many, many disappointments throughout her life's journey. This included having to endure racial discrimination most of her life in America, as well as being incarcerated in concentration camps during World War II. I think that Hisayo Yoshino would even have survived living with a mean old mother-in-law back in Japan. But I'm very happy that she made a very different choice early in her life. Thankful to her for persevering through her many difficulties so that her children would be free to have a much better life in America. My mother worked very hard. She was very devoted to her family. She lived to the age of 96. She left 6 children, 18 grandchildren, and 24 great-grandchildren when she passed on in 1990. Since that time, there have been more added to the family. Both my mother and my father's spirit continues to linger on in our memories. Thank you for listening.
For such a powerful story. Our next speaker is Gail Whang, and she'll be talking about her grandfather, Wang Sa Sun, and I think also her father, Paul Wang.
Hi, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Erika and Judy for enlightening us and sharing the story about Angel Island, which I never knew about growing up in San Francisco, going to school in San Francisco, taking California history, U.S. history, never learning about why Koreans came to this country, never learning about the history of other Asian Americans in this country. And when I was tremendously influenced by the civil rights movement and started to ask questions of my parents, like, what do you know about your parents and why did they come from Korea? What was it like? Why did they leave Korea in the first place? And what was it like living here? And they were so busy trying to make a living that they didn't know the story. So I started to do oral histories and started to ask my grandfather, and I didn't speak Korean. They spoke very little English, but through my dad I was able to get some translation and ended up doing oral histories of my grandfather, and he told me the story. Now, he came in 1913 during the Japanese occupation of Korea. Japan had annexed Korea. And my grandfather was involved in an underground organization trying to organize and basically get the Japanese out of their country. And he was a high school teacher at the time. And many of his friends were also involved in this underground organization, were captured, tortured, and killed. And so he felt like he needed to get out of the country and would try to further the cause of Korean independence outside of the country. His brother, Hwang Sa-young, had already come to the United States. So in the middle of winter, he and his wife crossed, they were living in the northern part of Korea, crossed the Yalu River, which was partially frozen, so it was very dangerous. This is a story that he told me. And he went into China, where he put on some Chinese clothes and pretended that he was from the northern province, Bokun province in China. So he pretended he was Bokunese. So when he was stopped by the Japanese police in this province, in his broken Chinese he said, "I'm Bokanese from Bokan province." So he was really proud of himself for getting past the Japanese police. And he made his way down to Shanghai, where he boarded the SS Mongolia. And this is a picture of the ship passenger list with his name and his wife, Chang Tae-sung's name. So this was, Judy had uncovered this document, and I was just thrilled to actually see his name on this document. So they come to San Francisco, and again, because of the laws against Asians owning any property, his dreams were dashed of he wanted to continue being a high school teacher, but because of racial discrimination wasn't able to continue. So he did some work as a laborer and eventually pulled together some funds to rent a cleaning shop on Mason and Washington Street called the Korean Cleaners. And in order to rent this place, he said that he was part Russian in order for the landlord to let him lease the place. So he had 3 children at the time. But the story of Korean immigration, many of the students who came, the young people, were politically active in Korea. So they came here and they continued the cause of Korean independence when they arrived here. And they formed organizations, and one of the organizations was the Korean National Association. And you saw earlier a picture of David Lee, who was also a minister and was the president of the Korean National Association. So because of this strong organization in the Korean community, they were able to go when Koreans arrived to Angel Island and basically vouch for them, took responsibility for the Koreans and said that. And also my grandfather was a part of these meetings where they provided translation and said that they would provide them with food, shelter, and help them find jobs. So as a result, many of the Koreans didn't spend a whole lot of time like their Chinese counterparts in Angel Island. This organization was so strong. They organized Korean language schools. So the second generation, they attended American schools here, and most of them lived around the area of Chinatown. But after school, they went to Korean language school. And the man in the black suit on the right, that's David Lee, who was the principal at the time. David Lee also published books in Korean for the Koreans to study and learn Korean language. So they were very active, and they took up the cause of really fighting and earning money to support the Koreans that came here, as well as to earn money to send back to the provisional government that was set up in Shanghai while their country was ruled by the Japanese. So one of the organizations is called the Hungsadan. His older brother, Wang Sa Sun, this is my grandfather's older brother, was also involved in helping the plight of Koreans who were enticed to Mexico. There were 1,000 of them who, again, left Korea because of the situation there and heard that they could make a living in Mexico. Come to find out, this is before the Mexican Revolution, that they were treated like slaves. So my granduncle went down to Mexico to try to bring Koreans up here, and there were 6 Koreans who came up from Mexico but were denied access to this country. So my grandfather had a son, which is my father, Paul Whang, and Paul also wanted to become a teacher. He attended Spring Valley as a youngster, and he was one of the first Korean graduates from San Francisco State College, got his degree in physical education where he wanted to be a PE teacher. He did a student teaching, he graduated, and at the time that he was ready to go out and find a job, he went to the counselor and said that he wanted to work as a teacher in San Francisco, and she counseled him and said, Asians will not be hired as teachers. And if you turn in your application, they will throw it in the circular file, which is the garbage can. So tremendously discouraged after wanting to be a teacher, he took on, this is him graduating from San Francisco State College. He took on odd jobs, got some work in the farms, picked fruit, and so one of the jobs that he got, and again thanks to Judy and Erika for uncovering this, he worked on Angel Island. And he worked there for about a year, I think, as a messenger servant in the hospital. So I'm very anxious to see the refurbishing of the hospital. And the reason that we knew about this, again, I didn't know anything about this. And again, because I didn't even know about Angel Island growing up in San Francisco, I didn't have this knowledge to be able to ask my dad these questions when he was alive. So again, I'm very much indebted to Judy and Erika. Turns out that my dad was questioned. There was a fire in the administration building, and he was one of the people that they questioned because he got off the boat to go to work on Angel Island, and he had seen somebody leave the administration building. So he was interrogated and asked questions about this. So after that, he joined the U.S. Navy. He actually tried to join the U.S. Navy because he heard about a special program to teach athletics in the Navy, and he was refused there also, another example of racial discrimination. And then shortly after that, he was drafted. Well, luckily, when he got out of the Navy, he passed the civil service exam and got a job where he spent his career for 30 years working in San Francisco Chinatown as a director of the Chinese playground and then as a director of the Chinese Rec Center. And in his capacity as director of both of these places, was like a father, was like a counselor, was a confidant to hundreds and hundreds of young children growing up in San Francisco with the playground, the center as the only place for children to go outside, get some fresh air, play. So he had a tremendous influence on many of the lives of the youth growing up in San Francisco Chinatown. He taught tennis, taught basketball, and 30 years after he retired, would go back and attend celebrations, and he was so thrilled to see my children, his grandchildren, participate in basketball tournaments. And to end, thanks again to Judy and Erika, my children now will have the benefit of really understanding more about their family's history as well as Asian immigration to this country.
I was one of the kids who grew up at Chinese Playground and remember Paul Whang dearly. And I really on the ball, I would have interviewed him before he passed. Our next speaker is Nora Steiner, who will be telling us the story of her mother, Alice Edelstein.
Hi. Thank you to Judy and to Erika for taking such an interest in my mother's story and including it in their wonderful book and inviting me to give a presentation today. My mother was one of approximately 500 European Jews who entered the United States in 1939 and 1940 through San Francisco as they fled from Hitler in the Holocaust. Her family called her Elfie, but after she came to the United States, she went by her middle name, Alice. She was born in 1922 in Vienna, Austria, to a very assimilated Jewish middle-class family. As you can imagine from this picture, she was a pampered only child. She had a large extended family in Vienna. My grandmother was a typical Viennese housewife. She was a talented seamstress and an incredible baker of Viennese cookies, cakes, and strudel. Her husband Maurice made a comfortable living importing lumber. He doted on my mother, and she remembered how he let her sit on his lap as a small child, sampling his coffee as well as his cigarettes. My mother, her parents, and grandmother lived in a large house near the Prater, the famous amusement park in Vienna. Vienna was the European center of theater, opera, art, music, and literature. My mother, seen here as a teenager, loved school, as well as trips to the countryside where the extended family would gather at a summer house. As my mother's cousin recalls, in my memory, the sun always shines, and time expands to fill the golden days. Next one. My mother was 15 when Hitler invaded Austria in March 1938. Life for all Jews in Vienna changed. My mother was forced to drop out of school. Jews could no longer work in most jobs. Believing that only men were really in danger, her father Maurice fled the country, managing to get a visa and passage to Santo Domingo in what is now the Dominican Republic. Much of the extended family, especially the young people, also started leaving. My grandmother and her generation felt that this Hitler thing would blow over. And although life was unpleasant, they weren't in danger. However, my mother foresaw that she and her mother better leave as well, and took it upon herself to get them out. In order to leave, you needed a sponsor in the United States who would vouch that they would support you financially if necessary. There was no family they could turn to. Probably with help from Jewish groups, she wrote letters to everyone she could find in the United States phone books with their last name to ask for sponsorship. They lucked out with a completely unrelated family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and made arrangements to leave. In 1939, just before her 17th birthday, my mother obtained a German passport. Austria was now part of Germany. Note that her passport has Nazi stamps as well as the prominent J, which stands for Juden or Jews. If that's not enough to identify Jews, she also has an extra middle name added of Sarah. To ease identification of Jews, this was added to the name of all Jewish women and girls. Men and boys had to add Israel as their middle name. By 1940, most routes out of the country were closed. Somehow she managed to get train passage for herself and her mother into the heart of Germany through Eastern Europe and to Asia, Japan, and then a boat to Angel Island. Thanks a million to Eddie Wang and his sleuthing on behalf of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. We are extremely fortunate to have the travel diary of Alfred Merrill, who was on my mother's voyage. He was an astute observer and a marvelous writer. Let me read you a few tidbits from the 22 pages he devotes to describing this trip. Once upon a time, there was a fairy tale. You went to the office of the American Express Company in Vienna. You secured a reservation, and then you sailed to America. Many, many miracles must happen if you want to be successful. The first miracle was to obtain an American visa. I don't want to waste your time explaining how many difficulties you have to overcome. I emphasize only that I had to wait 2 years. The second miracle was to finance the trip. The reservations must be paid in dollars, and nobody in Germany is allowed to have foreign money or foreign bonds. Therefore, if the emigrant has relatives or friends in America, they have to buy the reservations. But for us in Vienna, there was another way. The Jewish community in Vienna was entitled to sell dollars. Of course, we had to deposit 20 times more money in marks as the equivalent in dollars amounted to. The third miracle was to find a route. After many difficulties, we were able to secure reservations on the Trans-Siberia Express Railway and on the Japanese steamers of the NYK. I needed the visa of the United States, Japan, Manchukuo, which is Manchuria, Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, a special permit to leave Germany on the eastern border, and a recommendation of the German Minister for Foreign Affairs to the Russian consul in order to obtain the Russian visa. There were 50 passengers from Austria and 50 from Germany who also undertook that voyage. There were old men of 76 and children of 2 years. There was a lady with an unborn child. We were promised to be fed by the railway for 7 days, only during the trip from Moscow to the border of Manchukuo. The next 15 pages or so of the diary are a fascinating account of Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia in 1940. It's available online at the Angel Island Foundation website, and I urge you to read it if you're interested. I'll skip ahead to when they meet the boat. The next day, our steamer, Rakuo Maru, arrived in Yokohama. She was a boat of 10,000 tons only and very old-fashioned. Almost all passengers were steerage passengers. More than 100 men had to sleep and eat in one room. It was dirty and hot. Most of them preferred to sleep on the open deck. But the departure of the boat was a stirring event for all of us. Crowds of people, most of them Japanese women and children, stood at the pier waving their hands in Japanese flags. A band played. I felt that it was a great moment for the sake of which we had to undergo so many difficulties. It was the farewell from the old continent and from the old life. Our trip across the ocean lasted 26 days. It was a quiet trip over a peaceful sea and without seasickness. Well, now I'll depart from Mr. Merrill's diary. When my mother discussed this trip, she remembered only that she was seasick the entire journey. The crew served them fish 3 times a day, and I don't think my mother ate any of it. She lost some 20 pounds coming over. With deep gratitude again to Eddie Whang, I have another source of information from my mother's trip. A few years ago, unfortunately soon after my mother died, he found Ava Schott-Barrick, who was the woman on the right. She was exactly my mother's age, and they certainly knew each other on the voyage, but they never were in contact again. She now lives in Concord and is a dynamic 90-year-old who takes care of rescued wild animals for the Lindsay Museum. At any time, her house is full of tiny possums and sparrows, which she bottle feeds every 3 hours around the clock, which is actually one of the reasons she didn't want to come today. And she's very shy. She took the only pictures on the boat known to exist. My mother is on the left. Although she looks haggard, it is nice to know that she made friends and apparently did not spend the entire journey miserable and seasick. A Jewish newspaper took this picture when the boat landed in San Francisco. Amazingly, my mother and grandmother are standing right next to Ava. You can see them circled there. The refugees next had to be processed at Angel Island. Again from Alfred Merrill's diary, finally we reached the golden gates of San Francisco. Our endless voyage seemed to be finished, but after the boat had anchored, we had to experience bitter disappointment. We were not allowed to disembark. Instead of entering the land of liberty, we had to enter a kind of prison. The name of the place was Angel Island. But to stay there was not so pleasant as the name of this place would suggest. 2 weeks ago, the greater part of the station had been destroyed by a big fire. The ladies were separated from us, and we had only a few opportunities to see them. I believe most of the European refugees stayed only a few days or a couple weeks until they managed to obtain the money to get to their eventual destination. My mother remembered that everyone was nice, although they kept trying to fatten her up with oatmeal and milk, foods that she had a lifelong aversion to. They soon took the train to Milwaukee, where their sponsors helped them to get on their feet. And by all appearances, they really did get back on their feet. Both my mother and grandmother immediately went to work to support themselves and to bring Maurice out of the Dominican Republic. Alice helped with the war effort, rolling bandages for the American Red Cross. Here she is, looking like a Jewish Mother Teresa. She met my father, another Jewish refugee from Vienna, on a blind date, and they got married and had a baby boy. And my sister, who is here, she can stand up and wave. And me, the youngest. By now they had moved to Oakland. My mother always remembered that the San Francisco Bay Area was the most beautiful place she had ever seen, and they soon settled here. Here is Alice with her grandchildren. 2 of them are here and can stand up too. My mother always worked, enjoyed family and friends, and had a true love of life. She always regretted that she had to leave school at the age of 15 and never had the chance to continue. But as her cousin, another refugee from Vienna, said about her, Harry and Elfie's house was always welcoming, no matter what children, birds, and grandchildren were lodging there at the time. And we had fun playing Viennese humor on the hi-fi, cooking communal meals, exchanging knitting patterns and yarn, enjoying the beautiful backyard that made such a lovely setting for wedding. What a warm heart, ready to take care of grandchildren, friends, and relatives, entertaining her bridge-playing buddies, in-laws, and numerous acquaintances, and with it all, an unforgettable humor. My mother was never religious, and I believe she'd never entered a synagogue before coming to the United States. Nevertheless, I know she was pleased that her children and grandchildren kept the tradition going. Alice lived long enough to see her grandchildren become young adults. In her last years, she moved to Davis and lived with me when she became frail. My mother died 4 years ago, unfortunately before she had the chance to meet Judy and Erika and read their wonderful book. I know my mother was always extremely grateful that the United States took her and her parents in, and she never had a bad word to say about this country, except for that oatmeal and milk. When she died, we had her cremated and her ashes scattered just beyond the Golden Gate Bridge, close to where she started out in this country and lived so many wonderful years. Thank you very much.
Is Charles Egan, Professor of Chinese Language from San Francisco State University, and he will be introducing new poetry and writings that have been discovered since the publication of our book on Angel Island and in his research through many ethnic newspapers.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judy. Let's see, where's the clicker? Oh, how does it work?
Before Charles starts,
congratulate Erika and Judy on a wonderful book, which is a real landmark for immigration history. It's the first comprehensive study of all the people who went through Angel Island. Here is a previous landmark book, which many of you have read, Island, which Judy is also a part of, which is oral histories and about 135 Chinese poems from the walls. What I've been doing over the last several years is to find new materials. There are many, many more poems on the walls than were published. So there's about 135 in here. There's about 200 on the walls, although not all of them can be deciphered. There's also Japanese, Korean, all of these other inscriptions which hadn't been studied much, which I've been working on. And also, since, although Chinese wrote poetry on the walls for cultural reasons, public poetry is a big part of Chinese culture. The Japanese and Koreans and others didn't mean they weren't writing poetry. They just published it in newspapers instead of putting it on the walls. So what I want to read for you today is sort of a collection of some of these materials. Now, the island also deserves to be looked at as an art object. There's wonderful calligraphy on the walls. There's illustrations on the walls, and I hope to also to be able to include some of those materials. Here's the best of Chinese inscriptions on the walls. Unfortunately, many of them look more like that. The conditions are difficult, but keep going. And here's a poem that starts on one side, doesn't finish on the other till the other side of a wall. It's been cut in half. Here's a poem where only the first character of each line still exists, and the title on the side. It's been cut out by a door. Here was a wonderful poem from the book Island, but the only remaining part of it is about 3 characters on the broken wood on the left. Another oddity, a poem carved completely backwards on the wall. And another thing which is great, which I hope will soon be seen on T-shirts near you, are all of the carved illustrations that are on the walls. Ships, birds. I love this one. The next two were actually on plaster in the hospital. Fish. Here's a couple of humpbacks, I think. And a lovely little horse. So stay tuned. Okay, now let me read you a collection of some of the materials, the new Chinese materials, then a few Japanese and a few Korean. Okay? The recently discovered Chinese poems in the barracks provide variety and new perspectives, while the topics are mostly similar to those that are in the published poems. Homesickness, uncertainty about the future, anger at detention, and solidarity with compatriots at home. Clouds and hills all around, a single fresh color. Time slips away and cannot be recaptured. Although the feeling of spring is everywhere, how can we fulfill our heartfelt wish? It's been a long time since I left my home village. Who could know I'd end up imprisoned in a wooden building? I'm heartsick when I see my reflection. My handkerchief is soaked in tears. I ask you, what crime did I commit to deserve this? A hard journey of 10,000 miles across the Pacific Sea, yet before the waves were stilled, I was detained in prison grounds. For the sake of my studies, I never complained of hardship, but who knew there would be such high debts to pay? For 3 months I have been continuously imprisoned. This year has every day brought me 9 rounds of sorrow. Heaven has eyes and molds heroes' bones through suffering, but now I'm at a dead end and wipe the tracks of my tears. I'm distressed our ancestral land is in such peril, slashed and gouged for over 200 years. Compatriots must renew their will to strengthen the country. Chinese from then on will have no sadness. It's hard for Chinese to come to America. So much sadness in a far place. The foreign slaves have always bullied and cheated our country. When the people are rich and strong, we'll destroy the foreign lands. It's useless to become friends with those of narrow mind. It's useless to have wealth if one disdains the poor. It's useless to show off one's cleverness in daily affairs. Understanding human nature all comes from learning. Attention to details leads one to the proper way. Those who have not endured hardship cannot be said to have hot blood. Those who have experienced imprisonment never have cold hearts. And this is a very interesting one. Mr. Henry Wang of Salinas wrote the following poem on the wall when he was detained in 1927, but as he used a fountain pen, it is not visible there today. He returned to visit Angel Island in 1991 when he was 80 and told his story to docent Sandra Ginn. He later wrote out his poem from memory and sent it to Sandra, who then gave a copy to the foundation, which is this here. King Wen, imprisoned by the evil Zhou, I too am confined in a wooden prison. Half a year on, I've awakened from a gold mountain dream. As for equality and liberty, I still ask, when? Japanese inscriptions are of many kinds in the building, but they're not poetry. They tend to be very prosaic, names and dates, which is actually good because you can research the people and discover the writers, and if you're lucky, in a few cases, I've been able to find the families. What I'm reading for you today is from the Nichipei Shimbun newspaper. Now, I've made a selection that dates from the 1912 up to about 1927. The topics presented by Japanese poets include Angel Island detention, picture brides, impressions of their new lives in America, farming in the Central Valley, and exclusionary policies and unfair laws. Regulations are especially cruel on cold mornings at Angel Island. The suspicion of a disease of the eye on the island a long night. Why do I see such despair late summer at Angel Island? The following 4 short poems refer to the Isle of Demons, which features in the popular Japanese folktale Momotaro, Peach Boy. Arriving at Angel Island, I realize it's the Isle of Demons. On Angel Island, demon angels with protruding horns are wailing. On Angel Island, specters of demon angels all disappear. On Angel Island, in the dippers and the mortars, demon angels dwell still. The Month of March by Shimizu Kashin. Shimizu Kashin, who's shown here, is the pen name for Shimizu Terukichi, who arrived in 1915, to join his father, who was a bicycle dealer on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley. Kashin later published 2 books of poetry, one of which featured this woodblock print. March last year was the month when I, raised in the mountains, first took ship across the ocean, the hated month when I gazed at the hills through the iron bars of Angel Island. A night at Angel Island. In a stone prison on Angel Island, a Japanese girl is crying, leaving muddy streaks on her pale face as she clings to a chill window. From the chill window, what can be seen? Pale, eerie moonlight that keeps her from sleep. From the chill window, what can be heard? Dreamlike in the distance, white gulls faintly cry. The lingering sound of tears. A Japanese girl is crying, clinging to a chill window, muddy streaks on her face, in a stone prison on Angel Island. She sends a wireless telegram to her picture husband and waits at the ship, hoping he will come. She is worried she'll be rejected by her husband, whose face and heart she has never seen. Although he said this season is not the best, she has counted on her fingers, and this is the joyful month. For the sake of her husband's success, she's taken jobs she's not used to, washing dishes and scrubbing floors. She yearns for her beloved husband in the picture, yet upon arrival, she sees only a heartless immigration official. The following 2 really short poems show 2 sides of the picture bride experience. One celebratory, the other one not so much. When the new bride was allowed to land in America, she made sushi. She crosses to America and finds her husband is a dishwasher. In the New Year's dawn, San Francisco looks just like Nagasaki, wrapped in mountains. Sleeping in the big city, I wake as the first dawn's light shines on skyscrapers. Memory, like a puff of breath from a beautiful woman, the fog is floating in San Francisco's streets. Autumn grass. If you come to America, where gold falls from the sky, don't despair when you tread on withered grass. 1 year ago, I left my hometown, yet even now, a whiff of lingering scent brings my mind pain. Born subjects of the emperor, we live in a foreign land. At the new year, we make a toast. May your reign last forever. My hometown. Slurping the hiyamugi wheat flour noodles. Smooth, slippery, gobble smack. Slippery, smooth, swallow, gulp. Somehow it's like I've returned to Japan. Western food, Chinese food, Japanese food, our digestive organs can handle anything. But the one thing that's hard to digest is the spirit of American people. This utopia of freedom in the world is a place where the living standard is high, yet we are not happy. When I slurp the flour noodles, I start to miss my home. Yoneda Goso, known in the U.S. as Carl Yoneda, spent 2 months in detention, although he was an American citizen. While at Angel Island, he spent his days reading and writing poetry. Upon his release in early 1927, he published selections in the Nichibe Shimbun under the pseudonym Hamakyoshi. In later years, he became an important activist and organizer who played a key role in the founding of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And the following poems appear in Judy and Erika's book. Angel Island, what a sweet name, but there are no angels here, only nameless immigrant prisoners. Tears in my eyes have dried up after several days of incarceration. No more tears of sadness, no more tears of anguish. America is my country, so my birth certificate says, but America doesn't want me here. I hear sounds of different voices from the next cells, Chinese, Russian, Mexican. This tired traveler has crossed a vast ocean. Why must I sleep behind iron bars? The rain cries out and wakes me up because it pities me. Angel Island, sleeping tight, no matter whether you hear this song or not. It is the complaint of a foreign guest whose whole heart is burning. Even though it's said America is wonderful, how pathetic it has made me. If my mother knew about this, how shocked she would be. This border created by rascals, how can it be broken? I hope people all over the world will become brothers soon. That was written in 1925. Angel Island by Cloud. Angel Island, all the people said. So I thought it would be like heaven. Yet when the iron gate locks with a clang, it feels like hell. You, the masses of people who are wriggling in this steel-barred prison, you have a home, you have a country, so what is the reason for this sorrow? It must be a hungry belly that causes this karma. Farewell by Lee Jong-du, Stockton. Written on the day when for the last time I visited a brother who had come with me but was forced to return to Korea, leaving Angel Island, July 22nd, 1927. When my heart is in pain like this, how can you be at ease? A sorrowful twilight passes on Angel Island, while a white gull wanders over the water. My heart as I leave you, your heart as you go back, leaving me behind. Ah, there is no use in crying. The only thing we have is sorrow. Can the death of a parent be compared to this? Can the death of a friend be like this? Our eyes willing with tears, an indescribable, heart-rending farewell. If we could stop the wheel of destiny, you would remain in this land. And the final Korean poem I'd like to read doesn't mention Angel Island, but rather reflects Koreans' status as exiles, doing the best they can in America. I Miss You, My Brother, by Woon Ha, January 18, 1927, in San Francisco. Who can stop rushing time? It has been 8 years I have not seen you. A long 8 years of suffering and trouble has covered my forehead in lines and wrinkles. You are also a man. How could you not be changed? On a dark night, in a cold wind, falling and tumbling on a sandy shore, the memory of our crossing the Amnok still vivid in my eyes. Unforgettable Shanghai, Shanghai of the bitter taste. You go first and I'll follow after. Every single sound of our farewell song still lingers in my ears. It's been 8 years since you crossed the Atlantic. It's been 4 years since I crossed the Pacific. You in the east and me in the west. How could I not miss you? However, aren't we wanderers of destruction and people of no freedom? As I welcome the new year, I wish you good health. Pour all your blood and sweat into the success you have dreamed of. For the measure of blood and sweat sends the world of painful tears away.
Experiences that people had through Angel Island. We'd love to tell these stories on our website. So if you have any, visit our website and click on Immigrant Voices. You can post your own story and you can read other people's stories there as well. We can also help you with your research at the National Archives. If you think your family came through Angel Island or anywhere on the West Coast in the 20th century, we'd love to try to help you get in touch with the folks at National Archives. There's certain information they need to help you with your research, and we'd love to